So, imagine you were walking down this really beautiful tree-lined street. You know the exact kind I mean.
Oh, absolutely. Huge oaks arching over the road, the dappled sunlight hitting the pavement.
Right, exactly. It gives you that specific feeling of calm that you really only get when nature's brought right into the middle of a city. It's idyllic. It's honestly the reason people pay a massive premium to live in certain neighborhoods.
It is. I mean, it's what drives property values up. It keeps the ambient temperatures down in the summer. And frankly, it just keeps us sane in urban environments. We actually have a lot of data on this now.
Oh, really? Like hard data?
Yeah, totally. Like hospital recovery times are demonstrably faster when patients just have a view of trees out their window.
Mm.
Crime rates actually drop in greener areas. We are just biologically wired to love being around these things.
Which makes total sense. We love them. We want them around. But for today's deep dive, I want to force a bit of a perspective shift for you listening. I want you to take that exact same idyllic street and look at it through a very different lens, a much darker lens, honestly.
Here we go. Ruining the peaceful walk.
I have to, because imagine that massive oak branch, which, by the way, probably weighs as much as a grand piano, and it's just hanging there directly over a minivan parked at the curb. Or, think about that sidewalk that's buckling just a little bit because a root is pushing it up from underneath, just waiting to trip a jogger at dusk.
It really does change the picture completely when you look at it like that.
It flips it entirely. Suddenly, it is not a beautiful landscape anymore. It's a minefield. And that tension right there is the paradox we are grappling with today. We love trees. We absolutely need trees. But trees are giant, incredibly heavy, shedding biological organisms, and they live right on top of us.
Right. And sometimes, inevitably, they fall.
They do.
And, when they fall out in the forest, it's just biology. It's the circle of life playing out. It creates habitat on the forest floor. But when they fall in a city, that's a liability. That's a lawsuit or a destroyed roof and potentially a real tragedy.
Exactly. That is the core tension at the heart of our deep dive today. We are unpacking the Tree Risk Assessment Manual, specifically the 3rd edition. This is published by the International Society of Arboriculture, or the ISA. And from what I've seen, this is basically the Bible for figuring out when an urban tree is a treasure and when it's essentially a ticking time bomb.
It really is the definitive text. And it's so important to state right up front that this manual, it isn't just a guide on how to walk around pointing at dead branches. It represents this massive philosophical shift in how the industry thinks about safety.
How so?
Well, it's the gold standard roadmap for balancing all those immense benefits we just talked about. The stormwater management, the air quality, the aesthetics, against that very real potential for harm.
And the mission for this deep dive is really to understand how they strike that balance. Because, and I found this part incredibly fascinating, the manual makes this really bold claim right in the opening chapters. It says, flat out, we cannot have trees without risk.
Right. It's an absolute impossibility to separate the two. Eliminating all risk would mean you have to eliminate all trees.
Right, like if you want 0% risk of a branch falling on your head, you literally have to chop down every single tree and pave the entire world.
Exactly. And nobody wants that. Not the arborists, not the cities, not the homeowners. So the goal of the manual shifts completely. It moves away from this idea of making trees safe, because safe is a binary impossibility, and it moves toward managing risk to an acceptable level.
Okay, let's unpack that specific vocabulary, because the language they use here is very specific. And honestly, it's a little confusing for a layperson. The manual makes this huge, massive distinction between a hazard and a risk.
Yes, it does.
But to me, in just casual conversation, those words are total synonyms. Like if I say to a friend, that's hazardous, or I say, that's risky, I mean the exact same thing. I mean danger.
And that's exactly where the trouble starts for a lot of people trying to understand this. In the arboriculture world, and legally, which is where this really matters, they are completely distinct concepts. If you mix them up, you actually can't manage the problem at all.
Okay, so distinguish them for me. Make it stick in my brain.
Okay, think of a shark. Let's say a great white shark.
Okay. I'm picturing Jaws. Very hazardous.
Right. A great white shark is a biological killing machine. It has rows of razor-sharp teeth. It's fast. It's incredibly powerful. That shark is a hazard. The hazard is intrinsic to the thing itself. The shark literally is the hazard.
Okay, I follow. It's a source of potential harm just by existing.
Exactly. Now take that exact same shark and put it in a massive tank at the city aquarium behind 10 inches of reinforced acrylic glass. And you're standing on the dry side of that glass. Is the shark still a hazard?
Yes. I mean, it's still a shark. It hasn't magically turned into a goldfish.
Correct. The intrinsic danger is still there.
Yeah.
But is there a risk to you?
Minimal. practically zero, unless the glass breaks.
Right, because risk is actually a math equation. Risk is the hazard, plus the exposure, plus the likelihood of failure. In the aquarium tank, the likelihood of that shark actually getting to you is almost completely non-existent. So you have a very high hazard, but a very low risk.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Now, take that same shark, the exact same hazard, and drop it into the water at a super crowded public beach on the 4th of July.
Utter panic. That is high risk.
Exactly. The thing itself didn't change one bit. The context around it changed. And this right here is the absolute revelation of the Tree Risk Assessment Manual. A massive, rotting, totally dead oak tree standing in the middle of the Yukon wilderness.
Oh, I get it. That tree is the shark in the tank.
It's actually even safer than the shark in the tank. It's a shark in a universe where people don't even exist. That rotting oak is a massive hazard, meaning it absolutely is going to fall down. But the risk is zero because there was no target to hit.
Wow, okay, that clears it up perfectly. But this leads us to the part that I think is pretty scary for average homeowners, the concept of the duty of care. Because unlike the Yukon wilderness, most of us live in neighborhoods. We live right next to other people.
Yes, and this is the heavy legal weight that gets placed squarely on your shoulders as a property owner. Duty of care is this legal obligation to act as a prudent, reasonable person would to prevent harm to others. In the eyes of the law, if you own the land, you are the risk manager of that property.
I really hate that title, risk manager. I just wanted a nice backyard with, a tire swing for the kids.
I hear that all the time.
Yeah.
But you essentially bought that title the second you signed the deed. And here's the real kicker with duty of care. You cannot claim ignorance if a tree defect was considered obvious.
What defines obvious?
Well, if a tree in your front yard has been dead for 5 years, it has no leaves, all the bark is sloughing off, it's regularly dropping massive limbs into the street, and you do absolutely nothing about it, and then a storm comes and it falls on your neighbor's Porsche. You cannot just throw your hands up and say it was an act of God.
Because you knew it was a problem. Or you should have known. That's negligence.
That is the textbook definition of negligence.
Okay.
You breached your duty of care. But, and this is where the manual introduces the phrase reasonable and proportionate, if that same tree was totally green, leafy, it looked completely healthy to any normal person, but it had this weird hidden internal rot that only a microscopic drill could detect.
Please tell me I'm off the hook for that one.
You usually are. The law does not expect the average homeowner to be a trained botanist or an arborist. It just expects you to be reasonable.
Okay, that feels fair.
It is. It's about proportionality. It is not reasonable to expect someone to inspect a tree in the middle of an unused, dense woodland on the edge of their property every single month. That's totally disproportionate to the actual risk.
Because nobody is ever standing under it.
Right. But flip that around. Is it reasonable to thoroughly inspect a massive 200-year-old oak tree that hangs directly over the main entrance to a really busy elementary school?
Absolutely. You'd want eyes on that constantly.
And is it reasonable to do that inspection annually? Probably yes. That is a proportionate response. The amount of resources you put into checking for safety should directly match the potential consequences if something goes wrong.
I really like that distinction. It kind of stops us from being totally paranoid about every single twig that falls in the yard, but it keeps us hyper vigilant about the big stuff. Now, before we get into the real nitty-gritty of how they actually check the trees, we need to clarify the cast of characters the manual lays out.
Yes, the roles are very clearly defined.
Because we've got the risk assessor, the risk manager, and the arborist. And I feel like people just use the word tree guy for all three, so who is who?
It's incredibly important not to blur these lines, mostly to avoid massive conflicts of interest. The Tree Risk Assessor is the trained expert. Think of them as the scientist or the impartial observer. Their job is simply to look, analyze, and communicate the findings.
So they are gathering the data.
Right. They're the ones who write the report that says, hey, this tree has a probable chance of failing and hitting the garage within the next year.
Okay, so they just deliver the news. They're like a weatherman predicting a storm. They don't stop the storm.
That's a great way to put it. Then you have the tree risk manager. This is usually the property owner, the corporate client, or maybe a city parks official. They hold the purse strings, they control the budget, and they are the ultimate decision maker.
So the manager decides what to do with the assessor's weather report.
Exactly. The manager is the one who has to decide if that specific level of risk is acceptable or not. The assessor usually does not make the final call to cut a tree down. The manager decides to cut it down, based purely on the assessor's objective report.
That's a really big distinction. The assessor says, here is the factual situation, and the manager says, here is the action we are going to take about it.
Precisely. And then the third player in the mix is the arborist. That's the person or the crew actually showing up with the chainsaws and the ropes to perform the physical work, like the pruning or the removal.
Although sometimes it's the same company doing both, right?
It can be. Sometimes the assessor and the arborist work for the same overarching tree service company, but the roles themselves are conceptually distinct. One diagnoses the patient, the other operates on the patient.
Got it. Okay, so we have our team clearly defined, and we understand the underlying philosophy. Now let's get into the actual action on the ground. Section 1 of the manual deals with the 3 levels of assessment. But before the assessor even steps foot on the grass, there's something they have to define called the scope of work.
This is essentially the contract. It's setting the rules of engagement before anything happens. You as a manager can't just call an assessor and vaguely say, hey, go check the trees. That's useless.
You have to be specific.
Highly specific. You need to clearly define the targets we care about, which specific trees we're actually looking at, and crucially, the time frame.
The time frame. Why does a time frame matter for looking at a tree?
Because trees are living, growing, and constantly decaying biological things. So we have to ask, are we assessing the likelihood of this tree failing within 1 year, 3 years, 10 years?
Oh, I see. A tree might be fine right now, but bad later.
Exactly. A tree with a slow-moving fungal rot might be perfectly safe for the next 6 months. The risk is low. But over a 5-year timeline, that exact same tree might become extremely high risk. If the assessor and the manager don't agree on the time frame up front, the resulting assessment report is completely meaningless. Usually for standard assessments, we see time frames set at 1 to 3 years.
That makes total sense. Okay, so the scope of work is locked in. Let's talk about these 3 levels of assessment. Level 1 is called the limited visual assessment. In my notes, I just called this the drive-by.
And you wouldn't be wrong. That's often quite literally what it is. Level 1 is assessing a population of trees from a specific, limited perspective. Maybe you are driving down a street in a municipal truck at 10 miles an hour, or walking down a paved path pretty quickly. Your goal is just to catch the glaringly obvious problems.
So you're definitely not walking up and hugging every single tree.
No, absolutely not. You're scanning. You are actively looking for fully dead trees, massive cavities you can see from the road, huge hanging branches that are already broken, or severe dramatic leans.
When would someone actually use this level? It seems a bit basic.
It's used when you have a massive population of trees. Think about a whole city parks district or an electric utility company that has hundreds of miles of power lines. They have limited budgets and limited time.
So it's basically a triage system.
It is entirely an economic filter. If a city has 50,000 trees in its inventory, they simply cannot afford to do a comprehensive walking inspection on every single one of them every single year. It would bankrupt the Parks Department. So Level 1 lets them quickly filter out the 49,000 clearly healthy ones and flag the 1,000 sketchy ones for a closer look.
But there have to be huge limitations to that.
Oh, massive limitations. Primarily, you usually only ever see one side of the tree. If there is a catastrophic, huge crack on the backside of the trunk, the side facing away from the road, you were going to drive right past it and never know.
Which brings us to the next step, Level 2, the basic assessment. The manual calls this the absolute standard of the industry.
This is the bread and butter of tree risk assessment. When someone says they are doing a risk assessment, 95% of the time, this is what they mean. It's a ground-based visual inspection where the assessor literally walks completely around the tree, a full 360-degree view.
So no peeking from just one side anymore. You have to get in the dirt.
Never just one side. You'd be utterly amazed how a tree can look like a beautiful, healthy postcard from the street side, and then you walk around to the back and the entire trunk is completely hollowed out.
Wow. Now what's interesting to me here is the toolkit for Level 2. We live in this age of LiDAR and high-tech drones, which we will get to in Level 3, but Level 2 is surprisingly analog.
It really is beautifully lo-fi. I mean, you need your eyes, obviously, that's the main tool. You might use binoculars to look up into the canopy. You need a clinometer, which is a little device to measure the height of the tree. But honestly, the single most important specialized tool in the Level 2 bag might just be a mallet.
A mallet, like a cartoon wooden hammer.
Not quite a cartoon hammer, it's usually a specialized dead blow hammer, or a dense plastic mallet with a soft face. And you're not winding up and trying to hurt the tree, you're doing something called sounding it.
Okay, walk me through this, because I love this visual. Let's say I'm standing at the base of a massive 100-year-old elm tree. What am I actually doing with this mallet?
You start right down at the very bottom near the dirt at what we call the root flare. And you give the trunk a sharp rap with the mallet. Whack! You aren't trying to dent it. You are intensely listening to the return acoustic frequency.
What does a perfectly healthy tree sound like when you hit it?
It's a very solid, sharp thud. It sounds incredibly tight. It sounds dense. It's really hard to describe perfectly until you're out there and you hear it yourself, but it feels like hitting a solid brick wall. The energy just stops.
And what about a sick tree, a rotting tree?
It sounds like a drum. It's this lower frequency, resonating, hollow boom.
Like the bass suddenly kicks in?
The bass kicks in, and honestly, your stomach drops a little bit. Because that drum sound tells you that the cylinder inside is empty, the dense heartwood in the center is gone, eaten by decay, and once you hear that hollow boom at the base, you start tapping higher and higher up the trunk. You're trying to physically map the shape of the cavity using just sound.
You're trying to figure out how far up the hollow goes.
Exactly. Is it just a tiny little hollow pocket at the base, or is the entire 30-foot trunk basically acting like a giant wooden drinking straw?
It's exactly like being a doctor percussing a patient's chest or back to listen for fluid in the lungs.
It is exactly that. But there's a really critical nuance here that surprises a lot of people. Just because a tree sounds hollow, and is hollow, doesn't mean it has to immediately come down. This is a huge, huge public misconception.
Wait, really? Because if I tap a tree and hear a drum, I'm immediately assuming it's timber time. Cut it down before it crushes my roof.
Not necessarily. Think about the physics of a tree. A tree trunk is essentially a cylinder. Now think about a standard metal pipe. A pipe is completely hollow in the middle, but it's still incredibly strong in bending.
Sure, yeah. Scaffolding is made of hollow pipes.
Precisely. As long as the shell wall, meaning the remaining healthy solid wood on the outside edge, is thick enough relative to the total diameter of the tree, that hollow tree can stand perfectly fine for another 50 years.
That is wild.
So the mallet tells you that something is definitely wrong on the inside, but it doesn't automatically tell you if the tree is going to fail tomorrow. It just tells the assessor, hey, you need to look much closer at this specific spot.
But I imagine sometimes just looking and tapping with a plastic hammer isn't quite enough to make a final call, especially if the stakes are high. And that is when we level up to Level 3, Advanced Assessment.
Right. Level 3 is deployed when a Level 2 basic assessment is inconclusive. Or, very often, when the target value is so unbelievably high that the manager needs absolute data-driven certainty before making a decision.
Give me an example of a high target value.
Imagine a massive historic heritage tree standing directly over a priceless glass roof of a museum, or over a wildly busy downtown intersection. You don't just guess with a mallet there. You need hard data.
And this is where it gets really sci-fi.
It does. It gets very high-tech. We're talking about advanced aerial assessments, physically climbing the tree with ropes and harnesses, or flying specialized drones up to inspect defects in the upper canopy that you just physically cannot see from the ground.
I read in the manual about decay testing, too, with drills.
Yes, resistance microdrilling. It's a tool with a very long, incredibly thin needle that bores into the wood. The machine measures the exact mechanical resistance the needle faces as it goes in. So it gives you a graph showing exactly where the solid wood ends and the mushy decay begins inside the trunk.
Wow. And I also saw something called sonic tomography.
That is amazing technology. You place a ring of specialized sensors all around the trunk of the tree, and you tap them. It measures the speed of the sound waves traveling through the wood across the trunk. Since sound travels faster through dense, solid wood and slower through hollow, decayed wood, a computer software program takes all that data and creates a full, color-coded, two-dimensional image of the interior of the tree.
It's literally an MRI for a tree.
It's exactly an MRI for a tree. There are also things called pull tests, where engineers actually attach a high-tension line high up in the tree canopy and pull it with a mechanical winch. They attach inclinometer to the base to measure exactly how much the root plate lifts and moves under a simulated wind load.
They are purposely trying to tip it over just a tiny bit.
Yes, just a fraction of a degree to test the root strength. And we even do root excavation using a tool called an Air-Spade. It shoots a stream of highly compressed air that completely blows the soil away, revealing the entire root collar perfectly. But the air doesn't damage the roots at all, so you can visually inspect them.
That is just incredible. It really shows how much real hard science goes into this industry. It's not just a guy in a flannel shirt looking up, squinting and saying, yeah, it looks sketchy to me.
Far from it. It's structural engineering applied directly to living biology. But as you can imagine, level 3 is very expensive and time-consuming. You do not do this for every single maple tree in a municipal park. You only do it when the stakes dictate it.
Okay, so we've thoroughly assessed the tree. We know its condition. But as we established earlier with that shark analogy, a defective tree is only actually a risk if it has something to hit, which moves us perfectly into Section 2 of the manual, the target and the site. The manual has this incredibly blunt golden rule. No target equals no risk.
That is the mantra. You have to internalize that. If a tree falls in the woods and hits absolutely nothing in this risk assessment framework, it is not a risk. It's just a natural biological event.
So the assessor has to be just as obsessed with the targets as they are with the tree. They have to assess the who and the what. And the manual categorizes all targets into 3 distinct buckets: people, vehicles, and structures.
Correct. And they behave differently. People are fully mobile targets. Vehicles are mobile, or at least movable if they are parked. Structures are completely static. Assessing the risk to a static structure is honestly much easier because it's not going anywhere. It is always right there. Assessing the risk to people requires understanding behavioral patterns. How do people move through this space?
And this introduces the concept of the occupancy rate. I found this fascinating. It's basically answering the question, how often is the target actually in the danger zone?
Right. And we break that occupancy down into 4 specific categories. The first is constant occupancy. That means 247.
Like a house.
Like a house, an apartment building, or a hospital. The target is always there. If the tree falls towards it, it is guaranteed to hit the target.
Okay, then the next level down is frequent.
Frequent means the target is there a large portion of the day, but not always. Think about rush hour traffic on a major commuter road, or a really busy neighborhood playground during daylight hours. The target is there a lot. But if the tree randomly falls at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, it might hit nothing but asphalt.
Makes sense. Then we have occasional.
Occasional would be something like a nice backyard patio that really only gets used on sunny weekends. The target is absent the vast majority of the time.
And finally, rare.
A rare target is a remote, unpaved maintenance trail in the backwoods that maybe a single parks employee walks down once a month to check a fence line.
And understanding that occupancy rate must dramatically change the final risk calculation.
Completely. You could have a massive, totally rotting, terrifying branch hanging over a rare-use trail, and the overall risk rating might honestly just be low, because the chance of someone walking under it at the exact second it snaps is astronomical, while conversely, a much smaller, less scary dead branch hanging directly over a constant target, like a child's bedroom window, could be rated as high risk.
Exactly. The likelihood of impact heavily drives the whole equation. You can have a very scary-looking tree, but if the occupancy is rare, the overall risk remains remarkably low. Now, there's also this really interesting concept in the manual called target aggregation. Can you explain how that works?
Sure. Let's say you are assessing a tree next to a grocery store parking lot. When you look at targets, you don't assess the specific risk to the blue Honda Civic currently parked in spot number 4.
Because that specific blue Honda is going to buy their groceries and leave in 20 minutes.
Right. Instead, you assess the risk to parked cars as a general category. You aggregate or group the targets together because while the specific individual car changes constantly, the constant presence of a car in that spot is guaranteed during business hours.
That's a very practical way to look at it. Now, what about the physical size of the danger zone? What do we call the target zone? How much space are we actually worried about around a tree?
The standard rule of thumb for the target zone is typically a radius of 1 times the height of the tree. So if a 50-foot tall tree fails at the base, it can theoretically cover a 50-foot radius circle in any direction.
But the manual specifically mentions expanding that zone to 1.5 times the height if the tree is dead. Why is that? Why does a dead tree get a bigger danger zone?
Because of the shatter effect. It's all about the mechanics of the wood. When a green, perfectly live tree falls, the wood is supple. The branches bend and flex when they hit the ground. The tree absorbs a lot of its own impact energy. But when a brittle, bone-dry dead tree hits the ground, it literally explodes. It doesn't just thud and lay there. It sends heavy, sharp shrapnel flying in all directions. Debris bounces and projectiles shoot outward. You need a significantly bigger safety buffer to account for that shattering.
It's basically a fragmentation grenade made of wood.
It really is. And assessors also have to manually adjust the target zone for local topography, like slopes. A tree falling downhill will slide and roll much further. or severely leaning trees, which obviously have a highly predictable, specific direction of fall.
It's geometry, physics, and biology all mixed together. Speaking of the local environment, let's talk about site assessment, because an assessor has to read the landscape, not just the single tree.
You absolutely do. A tree does not exist in a vacuum. The surrounding environment dictates its structural stability just as much as its internal health.
One specific thing that stood out to me in the manual was this warning about edge trees. And reading about it, this sounds like a massive real estate development problem.
Oh, this is a classic textbook failure scenario. Imagine a dense, established stand of forest trees. They've all grown up together over 80 years, right? They protect each other from the wind, they buffer the gales, they function structurally almost like a single organism, a phalanx.
Okay, picture that.
Then a developer buys the land, comes in with bulldozers, and clears a huge lot for a new subdivision, but they leave just a single row of the existing trees right on the edge of the property line to act as a nice natural privacy screen.
Those remaining trees are suddenly completely naked to the wind.
They are entirely exposed. And the problem is, they haven't spent the last 80 years building the dense adaptive wood required to handle heavy wind loads, because they never had to. Their neighbors took the brunt of the force. So they are highly, highly vulnerable to something called wind throw being blown completely over until they can slowly grow reaction wood to brace themselves, which takes years.
So if I buy a brand new house next to a freshly cleared lot, those tall, skinny edge trees are immediately suspect.
You need to keep a very close eye on them for the first few years. And speaking of wind, another huge site factor is funneling.
What's that?
Skyscrapers, or even just dense rows of large buildings, can literally create wind tunnels. They compress the air and increase the wind speed dramatically. It's called the Venturi effect. A tree that was totally fine for decades before the new glass office building went up across the street might suddenly be experiencing hurricane-force localized gusts on a totally normal, breezy Tuesday afternoon.
Wow. The city literally changed the weather for that one tree. And I assume we can't forget what's going on underground either. The soil.
The soil is the foundation of the house. Shallow soils over bedrock physically limit root depth, making the tree inherently less stable. Compaction is a huge one in cities, where heavy construction equipment, or just decades of foot traffic, crush the air pockets out of the soil, literally suffocating the roots. And then there's the bathtub effect, which kills so many newly planted urban trees.
The bathtub effect. Explain that one.
Let's say you have dense, heavy clay soil in your yard. Clay does not drain water well at all. If you dig a nice big hole in that clay and you plant a beautiful new tree, and you fill that hole back in with loose, rich, fluffy potting soil.
Which seems like the right thing to do. You want to give it good dirt.
It seems right, but it's a trap. When it rains, the water flows easily through the fluffy potting soil, hits the dense clay walls of the hole, and stops. It can't drain out into the surrounding clay fast enough, so the water just sits there in the hole. It acts exactly like a bathtub holding water, and the roots of your new tree just sit submerged until they drown and rot away.
That is tragic. You think you are helping it, but you're drowning it. So an assessor really has to look down at the dirt just as much as they look up into the leaves. Which transitions us perfectly to Section 3 of the manual, tree biology and mechanics. This is the why behind tree failure. And I want to start with, honestly, one of the coolest acronyms I have ever heard in science, CODIT.
CODIT. Compartmentalization of decay in trees. This was a completely revolutionary concept developed by an incredible researcher named Alex Shigo. It changed the entire field of arboriculture forever.
It sounds like a secret agent protocol, like initiate CODIT.
It kind of functions like one inside the tree. The absolute core concept to understand here is this. Trees do not heal the way humans heal. If I get a cut on my arm, my body actively replaces the damaged tissue with brand new skin cells. The cut disappears. If you cut into a tree, it never replaces that damaged wood. It simply seals it off. It walls off the damage.
So it's purely damage control. It's quarantining the problem.
Exactly. The manual explicitly describes 4 walls of CODIT. Wall 1 acts to resist the vertical strut of the decay. It literally plugs the vascular pipes running up and down the trunk. Wall 2 resists the inward spread. It uses the dense late wood of the growth rings to stop the fungus from moving toward the center. Wall 3 resists lateral, side-to-side spread using the rake cells that run outward from the center like wheel spokes.
Okay, so that's 3 dimensions, up, down, inward, and sideways. What is wall 4?
Wall 4 is the barrier zone, and it is mechanically the strongest wall against the spread of decay. It is a completely new layer of specialized wood that the tree grows immediately after the wound occurs, growing directly over the damaged area to protect all the new future growth. It physically separates the old infected inner tree from the new, healthy outer tree.
So a tree is basically a submarine that has taken a torpedo hit and it's slamming the steel bulkheads shut to stop the flooding from sinking the whole ship.
That is a brilliant analogy, yes. And a strong CODIT response keeps the fungal decay permanently locked in a tight internal column. This is exactly why you can see a completely hollow tree that is fully leafed out, incredibly vibrant, and structurally completely stable. It has successfully compartmentalized the internal rot, shut the bulkheads, and just kept growing a new tree on the outside of the old one.
That explains so much. I always wondered how those totally hollow ancient trees managed to stand up to storms. But sometimes they need physical help standing up, right? That brings us to a concept called response growth, or what I like to call the bodybuilder effect.
Right, this is Biomechanics 101 for trees. Trees will actively add new wood in specific places where they sense they need more strength. If a tree senses a weak spot, a crack, or increased mechanical stress from wind, it dedicates energy to laying down extra, thicker wood right in that exact spot. It's exactly like a bodybuilder working a specific muscle group to handle a heavier weight.
So those weird, ugly bulges and bumps we often see on trunks, those aren't tumors.
No, in most cases, those are actually symptoms of strength. We call them woundwood or ram's horns.
Ram's horns.
Yeah, it's this thick rolling wood that looks like curved horns, slowly curling inward, trying to physically close over a cavity opening. Or you might see ribs and seams, these long vertical bulges running up the trunk that look almost like a massive vein popping out of a bicep. That rib indicates the tree is aggressively reinforcing a hidden internal crack or a stress line.
So if I'm an assessor and I see a big, ugly bulge on a tree, I shouldn't automatically panic.
You should definitely be highly observant. The bulge means there's undeniably a defect underneath it, but the bulge itself means the tree is actively and successfully compensating for it. The real danger, the massive red flag, is when you see a severe defect, like a deep crack, and there is absolutely zero response growth around it.
Because that means the tree isn't fighting back.
Right. It means the tree has no energy reserves left to build new wood, or it means the crack is brand new and catastrophic. Lack of response growth on a known defect is a major warning sign of poor health.
Good response growth means the tree is fighting. Lack of it means it's giving up.
Precisely. And this all ultimately boils down to the engineering concept of load versus capacity. A tree failure is a devastatingly simple physics equation. The tree breaks when the load, meaning the force of the wind, the ice, or just gravity, becomes greater than the load-bearing capacity of the wood.
It's a literal battle between the wind and the wood.
And the concept of the lever arm is critical to understand here. When the wind hits the very top of a tall, dense canopy, it creates massive mechanical leverage on the roots and the lower trunk. It's exactly like using a really long metal wrench to turn a stubborn bolt. A relatively small force applied at the top of an 80-foot lever creates huge, massive twisting force down at the bottom.
But trees have a built-in trick for this, right? The manual talked about damping.
Yes. Trees sway. That dynamic movement is crucial. It physically dissipates the kinetic energy of the wind. A perfectly stiff, rigid tree is actually much more likely to snap under pressure. You want that fluid dynamic swing.
It's exactly like how they design modern skyscrapers in earthquake zones. They are built to sway and flex, not stand rigid. Okay, so we understand the biology and the physics. Let's move to Section 4, Inspection and Defects. We are putting on our assessor hats now. We are actively hunting for trouble. Remind me, what are our primary visual inspection techniques?
Well, we mentioned sounding the trunk with the mallet. You're carefully listening for those tonal changes. A sharp, solid click or thud usually means solid, dense wood. A lower frequency drum sound indicates a hollow cavity or bark that is separated from the wood.
And probing, we briefly touched on that.
Right. Probing is physically using a thin metal rod, or sometimes a specialized tool, to gently push directly into a crack or an open cavity. You are checking two things. How deep does this hole actually go? And is the wood inside soft, wet, and mushy, which confirms active decay, or is it hard and sound?
Okay, so we are tapping and probing. But what are the actual key defects we are hunting for? What's the worst stuff?
Number one on the list is always dead wood. It is highly, highly likely to fail. It has lost all its moisture, so it is incredibly brittle. It absolutely will fall eventually. It's not a question of if, it's strictly a matter of when.
Okay, dead wood is an easy spot. Then there are cracks. But the manual makes it clear that not all cracks are equal.
No, they behave very differently. You have shear plane cracks, which are essentially the separation of the concentric growth rings. But the truly scary ones, the drop everything and run ones, are transverse cracks.
Transverse means horizontal, right? Cutting across the grain.
Yes. Think about how a tree is built. It's built of millions of long vertical cellulose fibers running up and down. A crack going horizontally across those fibers means the primary structural fibers are literally snapping in half. It indicates that the tree is in the active process of failing right now. If an assessor spots a transverse crack, that is usually an immediate emergency.
Yikes. Okay, good to know. Now, what about weak branch unions? I see this term a lot.
This is incredibly common, especially in certain species like Bradford pears or maples. You look for something called codominant stems. That is when two stems or trunks of roughly equal size are growing upward from the exact same point. It's like a giant letter V.
And the V shape is bad structurally.
The V shape is very often bad because it leads to something called included bark. As those two stems aggressively grow thicker and thicker over the years, they push violently against each other. The bark on the inside of the V gets trapped between the two expanding stems.
Oh, I see. It gets squished inside the joint.
Right. And bark does not physically bond to bark. There is no wood-to-wood structural connection there. The trapped bark actually acts like a wedge being driven downward into the trunk. So instead of a solid joint, you basically have a giant wooden wishbone just waiting for a strong wind to split it in half. You generally want branches to form a U shape, not a tight V shape.
U is good, V is bad. Very easy to remember. And what about the hitting stuff like decay? If we can't see inside, how do we know it's there without drilling?
We look for external indicators. The manual splits these into definite and potential indicators. Definite indicators are things like fungal fruiting bodies. Those are the cunks, brackets, or mushrooms you see growing directly right out of the trunk.
So a mushroom on a tree isn't just a cute forest aesthetic.
No, if you see a mushroom physically attached to the bark, the fungal network is already deeply established and eating the wood inside. The mushroom is just the reproductive organ.
It's literally just the tip of the iceberg.
Exactly. Nesting holes are another massive definite indicator. Woodpeckers and nesting birds generally do not expend the massive energy required to excavate a hole into perfectly solid oak. They seek out existing rock because it's soft. So if you see a nice, perfectly round hole with a bird flying in and out, you can guarantee there's a vertical column of decay hiding right behind it.
That is so clever, using the local wildlife as your X-ray machine. And finally, we have to look down at the very bottom. Root problems.
The hidden killer of urban trees. Specifically girdling roots. These are roots that, instead of growing outward, away from the tree, start wrapping circularly around the base of the trunk. As the trunk expands outward and the root expands inward, the root literally strangles the trunk, slowly cutting off the vascular flow of water and nutrients.
It chokes itself to death.
Yes. And then you have severed roots. This usually happens from human trenching, like installing a new utility pipe or fixing a buckled sidewalk. If you cut the major structural roots on one side of a tree, you essentially cut the feet off the tree. It instantly loses its mechanical stability on that side.
Okay, so we've done the field work, we've gathered all this incredible data, we've sounded the trunk, checked for the V crotches, evaluated the roots, and thoroughly documented the target zone and occupancy. Now we have to actually make sense of it all. This brings us to Section 5, the Qualitative Risk Matrix system. This seems to be the real brain of the entire operation.
It is. This is exactly how the industry moves away from subjective guessing, like just saying, that tree looks dangerous, and moves toward a highly structured, defensible logic. It's a standardized two-step process using two distinct matrices. It gives everyone in the industry a common, objective language.
Okay, walk me through the steps. Step 1 involves likelihood.
Right. Matrix 1 combines the likelihood of failure with the likelihood of impact.
Okay, let's run a hypothetical scenario to make this concrete. Let's say we have a massive dead willow tree, a widowmaker willow, leaning directly over a park bench.
Perfect scenario. Let's say there is a huge, totally dead branch hanging right over the bench. The assessor determines that the likelihood of failure for that specific branch is imminent. It is currently hanging by a thread of bark.
And the bench is right on a busy path. It's used every single day by people eating their lunch.
So, based on our earlier definitions, the target occupancy is frequent to constant. Therefore, the likelihood of impact is rated as high.
So the math is imminent failure multiplied by high impact. What does Matrix 1 spit out?
You cross-reference those on the chart, and Matrix 1 says the combined likelihood is very likely.
Very likely. Okay, but that is not the final risk rating yet, right?
No, it is not. That is just step 1. Step
Okay.
2 is Matrix 2. You take that very likely result from the first matrix, and you cross-reference it with the consequences of failure.
Consequences meaning, physically, how bad the damage will be if it hits.
Right. And the categories for consequences are negligible, minor, significant, or severe.
Well, if a grand piano-sized branch hits a person sitting on a park bench.
That is undeniably severe. It means serious injury or a fatality.
So we take very likely from Matrix 1 and cross it with severe consequence.
And Matrix 2 outputs the final risk rating.
Yeah?
Extreme.
Extreme risk. Okay, that feels entirely justified for that scenario. So what are the 4 possible final ratings a tree can get?
They are very straightforward. First is low risk. This means the risk is completely acceptable. No immediate action is needed whatsoever. Second is moderate risk. This usually means you retain the tree and monitor it. You might mitigate it if the fix is cheap and easy, but it's certainly not an emergency. Third is high risk. This means mitigation measures are actively needed. You generally need to do something physical to lower the risk to an acceptable level. And finally, extreme risk. This is a flashing red alert. Immediate action is required. In many cases, you might need to physically cordon off the area with caution tape right that very second before you even arrange for the tree crew to come out.
This matrix system seems incredibly useful because it forces the assessor to explicitly justify their conclusion. You can't just walk up to a client and say, yeah, it looks really scary, cut it down. You have to formally say, it is a probable failure multiplied by a high impact leading to a severe consequence.
Exactly. It creates a paper trail of logic. But, and the manuals are very refreshingly honest about this, there is still inherent subjectivity in the process.
Even with the charts.
Even with the charts. Because at the end of the day, assessor judgment and human bias still play a massive role. Is that crack truly probable to fail, or is it already imminent? That distinction is a human judgment call based strictly on the assessor's past experience. The matrix is a tool, but the final rating is still an educated professional opinion, not an absolute guarantee of the future.
So let's say we have our report and we have a high-risk tree. Now what? Section 6 deals with mitigation and reporting. And importantly, we don't always just have to rev up the chainsaws and chop it down, right?
Absolutely not. Complete removal is always viewed as the absolute last resort. Mitigation is simply about reducing the calculated risk. And we have 2 main levers we can pull to do that: target-based mitigation and tree-based mitigation.
Target-based mitigation seems incredibly smart. It's literally just move the target.
It is very often the cheapest, easiest solution, and obviously the best one for preserving the tree. In our Widowmaker willow scenario, what if we just unbolt the park bench from the concrete and move it 20 feet to the left?
Well, then the likelihood of impact drops instantly to 0.
And the risk mathematically disappears. Problem solved. Reroute the walking path. Build a small fence around the drop zone. You completely remove the risk without ever touching a single branch on the tree.
It's so simple. It's almost funny. But obviously, you can't always move the target. If the target is a house or a busy highway, you can't just slide it 20 feet to the left.
No, you can't. And that is when you pivot to tree-based mitigation. Pruning is the most common. You physically reduce the weight of the defective branch, or you thin the canopy to reduce the sail area so the wind doesn't catch it as much. You reduce the lever arm.
What about cabling and bracing? I see steel cables up in trees sometimes.
Yes, that is installing structural hardware to physically support a weak union, like those V-crotches we talked about. You drill high-strength steel bolts through the stems and connect them with heavy steel cables so they can't split apart in the wind.
It's literally like putting the tree in a giant orthopedic cast or a sling.
Essentially, yes, it limits the independent movement of the stems. And then, of course, if none of those options adequately lower the risk, or if the tree is completely dead, removal is the final option on the table.
There's a specific term in this section I wanted to ask about: residual risk. What does that mean for the property owner?
This is a critical concept for the risk manager to understand. Residual risk is the level of risk that remains after the mitigation work is completely done.
So the risk doesn't go to 0.
Almost never. If you prune the heavy deadwood out of a mature canopy, the overall risk rating might drop from high down to low. But there is still a massive tree standing there. The manager has to formally accept that remaining low residual risk. As we said at the start, you can never get to absolute 0 unless you pave the world.
And finally, to wrap up the process, you have to write it all down: the reporting standards.
Yes. A written report is the absolute standard for legal liability. Verbal reports are basically useless in a court of law. If it isn't written down in a formal document, it didn't happen. And the report must explicitly state its limitations. It must clearly state that it is merely a snapshot in time.
Because, again, trees are living, dynamic things.
Right. An assessment report is valid for the exact day it was written. If a massive freak ice storm hits the city the very next day, loading the branches with thousands of pounds of ice, all the previous calculations are out the window. That's why assessors also provide a reassessment interval.
Like an expiration date on the report.
Exactly. They will write, reassess this tree in 3 years, or reassess immediately following a major storm event. It keeps the duty of care active.
So, zooming out from all the matrices and the biology, what does this all mean for us, for the listener who just wants to enjoy a peaceful walk in the park without carrying a clinometer?
I think it means we should deeply appreciate the sheer complexity of managing nature inside a city. Tree risk assessment isn't about looking for excuses to cut down trees. It's actually the opposite. It's about providing a framework that enables us to live with these massive organisms safely, preserving them for as long as humanly possible.
It's an ongoing relationship. It's that continuous feedback loop. Assessment, then mitigation, then reassessment. It never really ends.
It never ends because the trees keep growing, the internal decay keeps creeping, and the environmental conditions keep changing.
Which actually brings me to a final, slightly provocative thought I want to leave you, the listener, with today. Earlier, we talked about safety factors, how trees naturally grow extra wood, making themselves stronger than they strictly need to be to handle normal, everyday weather. They have a built-in biological buffer.
Right, the mechanical safety factor. It's what keeps them standing.
But our global climate is rapidly changing. What we used to call extreme weather, the 100-year storm, the massive microbursts, the prolonged droughts, is rapidly becoming our new normal. The wind loads hitting our cities are changing. The soil hydrology is changing.
That is the big looming question hanging over the entire arboriculture industry right now.
Will our historical definitions of safe actually hold up? Are these massive heritage trees that have proudly stood for 150 years suddenly going to find that their biological safety factors just aren't enough for the storms of the next decade? And ultimately, how much baseline risk are we as a society truly willing to accept just to keep a piece of wild nature alive in our concrete jungles?
That is exactly the profound question every single tree risk manager is going to have to answer in the coming decades. The math is changing.
It really is. Something heavy to chew on the next time you park your car under the shade of that big, beautiful neighborhood oak tree. Thanks for taking this incredible deep dive with us today.
Thanks for having me. Safe travels, everyone.